Well, welcome. My name is Lindsay Benstead. I am Director of the Middle East Studies Center at Portland State University. We want to welcome you here today to our panel focusing on the current politics and society of Afghanistan. We are honored to have three guests with us, all of whom have studied over many years the politics and society of Afghanistan. I'll introduce them in a moment. I would ask that you hold your questions until the end of the event, but you're welcome to put your questions in the chat field. And after the three presentations, I will open us up for a discussion. I want to thank Corinne Hughes, MESC Outreach Coordinator, for getting the technical side of our panel ready for today. Our first speaker is Professor Brent Farr. He is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Sociology at Portland State. He has worked for many years in Afghanistan and Iran. He has recently published several articles on Afghanistan, including Who Are the Taliban? In addition, he is completing a book on Afghanistan that focuses on what went wrong in Afghanistan and the crisis of Afghan refugees and internally displaced people. Second, we have Professor Benjamin Hopkins. He is a historian of modern South Asia, specializing in the history of Afghanistan and British imperialism on the Indian subcontinent. He has authored, co-authored, and co-edited numerous books on the region, including The Making of Modern Afghanistan. He is currently working on a concise history of Afghanistan for Cambridge University Press. Dr. Nukhet Sandal earned her PhD in politics and international relations from the University of Southern California in 2010, and she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute of International Studies at Brown University. In addition to numerous book chapters, she has published articles in the European Journal of International Relations. She is currently the chair of the Religion and Politics section of the American Political Science Association. I'd like to be the first to thank our guests for being here, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. So thank you. I'll pass the floor to Professor Farr.
It's good to see everyone here today, and I see in the audience some old friends, and look forward to having a good discussion about that. And I want to thank Corinne and Lindsay for putting this on. And I want to give a little plug. I think the people at Portland State know this about the Middle East Studies Center, one of the oldest Middle East Studies centers in the country. And we continue to offer all four Middle East languages. I guess Turkish is a little bit up in the air, but it's done great things, and it's been around since the 50s. You know, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan on August 15th, it surprised a lot of us. The Taliban takeover didn't surprise a lot of us. It was the timing of it. And it created a lot of problems. The Ghani government collapsed, and Ashraf Ghani, allegedly with a suitcase full of money, fled at first to Uzbekistan, I believe, and now he's in the United Arab Emirates. So the collapse of that government was something. So what's going to happen and who the Taliban are and how this all is going to resolve in Afghanistan is still up in the air, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. Particularly, I want to talk about a couple issues. One of them has to do with the role that's gotten a lot of publicity, is the role of women under the Taliban. And also, if we have time, I'd like to talk about the Shia, primarily the Hazaras, and the persecution that they faced in the old Taliban. So that's where I'd like to go, and I'll try to keep my remarks relatively brief. So I think the important issue that a lot of people have been following is the treatment of women. There's been reporters who have talked to women and documented women being beaten and women being imprisoned and women facing a lot of problems under the Taliban. A lot of it has to do simply with, being told not to show up or being afraid to show up. There's an article in the New York Times this morning about women judges. When in the 20 years that the Taliban was not in power, that US and NATO forces were in Afghanistan, it seemed like there was a lot of progress with women in Afghanistan. There's women judges, there's women professors, there's women medical doctors, there was even a woman general in the military. And it appeared women reporters, women anchors in the television news and so on. It just seemed like it was a good time for women in the last 20 years, and all that seems to be ending. But a lot of this is a little bit misleading, because in Afghan society, in the traditional Afghan society, women have a tough life. Women in the rural areas are married at a young age, in arranged marriages, are expected to have male heirs, have very few rights, are oftentimes beaten. Studies have found that 4 out of 5 Afghan women saying at one time in their life they've been beaten, and so on. So in the rural areas, well, I'll put it differently, in the progress that it seemed that we were seeing that women had made was largely confined to Kabul and perhaps Herat, and maybe a few other major cities, but among the upper class. But among lower class women, the situation has been quite difficult. And if you go out to the villages, like I say, the condition, as you'd find in many agricultural countries, the situation with the women is much more severe. So to some degree, what the Taliban has been talking about, and we were talking about this before it started, the Taliban talk about going back to Islamic or Sharia law. Recently, the head of education, the new Taliban head of education, was saying that women will be educated, but according to Sharia law or according to Islamic law. Well, I was thinking about this and looking at other Islamic countries. In Iran, certainly Islamic country, there's more women at the university than there are men. Women are doctors and professors and all types of things. And even though they have to wear scarves, still the position of women, it's an Islamic country. In Pakistan, certainly an Islamic country, women are in the parliament, women are, they had a woman prime minister. In Turkey, women go to college, women participate with men in various kinds of jobs. So when somebody says, according to Islam, women should be oppressed, I don't get it. Because if you look around at Islamic countries, there's a big variety of how women are treated. So what's the Taliban talking about here? Well, what the Taliban is talking about, and even though they say this is according to Sharia law, or according to Islamic law, they're really talking about tribal culture, Taliban tribal culture. In the traditional, these are the Taliban, let's not forget, are Pashtun, tribal Pashtuns from Kandahar largely, and the Haqqani network, which is even more draconian than the Kandahar Pashtuns. And among the Pashtun society, women have an expectation with regards to how they're supposed to behave. They're married at a young age. They're expected to have a male son. They work in the fields, and they have a tough life. And so when the Taliban really are talking about the Islamic education of women, they're really talking about the Pashtun tribal, the tribal traditions with regards to this. I'm not saying that they're being insincere. I think they believe that. But all along, many of the things that the Taliban have done can be traced back to Pashtun tribal customs. They have a thing called Pashtun Wali, which is a code of ethics that the Pashtuns believe in. The interesting thing about it is if you ask different Pashtuns, there's different things in it, but that's another story. But with regards to how people should behave, it has to do with bravery and revenge, and in that is how women should behave. So what you're seeing in Afghanistan right now is not a return to some kind of Islamic notion of how women should be treated, even though that's what they believe. If you look around the Islamic world, you see women do all types of things. And so it's really regards to tribal codes. So let me just say one last thing about the Hazaras. And I don't know really how to explain this, but I've been working with the Hazara community for 50 years, 40 years, something like that. And they are mostly Shia. And as people who follow this know, that they have been persecuted partly for their race or because they're Hazaras, but mostly because they're Shia. And for some reason, that's hard to explain. The Deoband Muslims, who are the background of the Taliban, have disliked the Shias. Now, recently, there's been a couple bombings in Kandahar, and I think one in, I can't remember where it was, Jalalabad or someplace, and at mosque, killing dozens of Hazaras and Shias that were primarily, the bombings were done by the Islamic State. So I'm very concerned about that. I was telling the panelists that I've been working myself to try to help some of the Hazaras get out of Afghanistan, and we've gotten a few families out. I've sponsored a Hazara family who's come to Portland, and we expect other refugees to come to that. So that come to Portland. So this is an important issue that I think needs to be discussed, is the treatment of the Hazaras, as partly because they're Hazaras and partly because they're Shia. So I think I'll stop with that and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hopkins.
Well, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon. I know it's slightly earlier in Portland than out in DC where I am. I'd like to begin just by thanking the organizers for the invitation to join you. I wish it was under better circumstances. I'm sure those of us that work on Afghanistan are, it's been an exhausting couple of months, and I'm afraid it's not going to get any better. I'd like to slightly diverge from Professor Farr's comments, which I think are extremely useful in setting the stage and really important to think about, and address slightly a different set of contingencies and issues regarding the conflict in Afghanistan. And I'll break my comments down in really three sections. And the first is talking about the war that both the American public and the American political class would very much like to believe is over. You know, it's incredible to see how little reporting there is now on Afghanistan, when a mere 6 weeks ago it was the story. And I think that is really indicative of the place that Afghanistan has held in the political and popular imaginary ever since 2001. It's the least reported war since the First World War in print media and online, as well as news media generally. So it's a pretty stunning kind of attitude we've held towards that. But as the United States would like to think we've ended our endless war of 20 years, we very much forget that actually Afghanistan is in the midst of its 43rd year of war. That the violence we're seeing now, with hiatuses, which this could be one of, started with the Saur Revolution in April of 1978 and has largely continued since then. I think it's very much too early for us to say one way or the other whether the war is over. I think everyone on the panel can probably venture a guess, and it's probably a very similar guess that this is more likely a hiatus than a termination of violence. But I do think it's very much an open question. And even when it comes to American involvement, despite the protestations of the Biden administration, the war by no means is over. They've simply refashion the language with which we talk about it. Now you'll see the administration talking about over the horizon capabilities and operations, which simply means, we can do drone strikes, which, as we saw, kill civilians in the middle of downtown Kabul, from US air bases that are pilots are stationed in South Dakota while the drones themselves are flying out of Pakistan. So I think it's very important to be explicit about that up front. I also think that it's very important for us to note that there's a big difference between ending a war and fashioning a peace. And this is particularly important when it comes to the Taliban, as they move from success on the battlefield to forming some sort of government. And I think it's, while they formally have created a government, a caretaker government, there are significant questions as the Taliban moves from military victory or seeming military victory to actually governing a country. As a historian, I'm always wary of looking to the past as a predictor of the future. That said, we do have an experience of the Taliban trying to make a similar transition after 1996 and largely failing to do so. And I think the initial indications of the Taliban's willingness and ability to govern are extraordinarily limited. And that's something that I'm sure we can return to in questions. So the war is not over. Secondly, I think on that issue about governance, we need to think about some of the challenges facing the Taliban or indeed any government of Afghanistan that have been really constant over the past 43 years and are going to shape the future of the country moving forward. First of all, we need to acknowledge the stakes of the ongoing Afghan civil war. For good or ill, up until the Saur Revolution in 1978, there was an imperfect but nonetheless workable and somewhat stable political compact upon which state power rested in Afghanistan. And briefly stated, that was that the state was an extremely limited entity which focused by and large on the urban centers of Afghanistan and claimed authority over the countryside, though never meaningfully exercised it over the countryside, because the state knew that if they did, it wouldn't work out well. Of course, that changed with the communists when they took over with a very much modernizing regime that really upset that political compact that had secured a modicum of peace through much of the 20th century. Now, as that political compact collapsed, it has never been meaningfully revived, nor do I think it could at this point, nor has it been rewritten. That was never the case under the Karzai or Ghani administration during the American occupation, nor are we seeing any move towards the Taliban addressing that real existential issue about the Afghan polity. And so I think that's something really important for us to bear in mind. That said, I think that there are three real issues practically facing the Taliban or any government of Afghanistan that we need to look at. And those are what I would characterize as the practicalities of governance in Afghanistan. The first is a political economy of subsidy. During 20 years of intervention in Afghanistan, the United States was quick to decry the corruption of the political class and essentially that Afghanistan is a money pit. The American analysis was that it was a money pit because of state failure. Actually, as a historian, Afghanistan was always designed to be a money pit. When the British created the modern Afghan state with the Treaty of Gandamak in 1879, they put at the core of that state a dependency on foreign largesse. It was much easier to influence Afghans through the power of the purse than it was to control them. And so ever since the mid-19th century, the Afghan state has been fundamentally dependent on a foreign subsidy. In fact, the last Ghani administration budget in 2019, out of approximately $11 billion in national budget, $6 billion came from foreign subsidy. The rest came from some taxation, about $2 billion in tax, and then block grants from elsewhere. Over the past 100 years, a colleague of mine, Niamatullah Bijan, who's at Oxford, has looked at the records for what they're worth and found that on average, the Afghan government has relied upon foreign subsidy in the realm of a low of 25%, upwards of 45% of its national budget every year on foreign subsidy. And that is a reality that the Afghans are going to continue moving forward. And I think it's part of the reason that the Taliban are so interested in foreign recognition, because they would like to resume that subsidy. A second issue is political legitimacy, which any government of Afghanistan is going to face. The Taliban obviously need to legitimate themselves to some constituencies, which will ensure their rule, and probably bank on a great deal of indifference amongst the majority of the Afghan population. I don't see that they can, really accede to widespread legitimacy of amongst the Afghan populace, but rather look towards the indifference of the majority of the Afghan populace while securing their rule on a relatively narrow base of support. And the third issue that's going to face the Taliban, and I would argue sank the Ghani and Karzai administrations, are the risen expectations of the Afghan population. The majority of the Afghan populace was born after the American intervention in 2001. If you go back to the Saur Revolution in 1978, more than 75% of the Afghan population was born after that date. So we're dealing with an extraordinarily young populace, an extraordinarily scarred populace with, experienced war, but one that also over the past 20 years has come to expect certain things out of the government, which the Ghani administration largely failed to deliver on. And I think was, in part explains why nobody was willing to really put themselves on the line to save that administration. So I think those are three real kind of practicalities of governance that we need to bear in mind. The other thing that I think this actually points to is that the real problem facing Afghanistan, both during the American occupation and now in the post-occupation period, is not a pathology, as it were, of the Afghan nation. So much commentary is talked about the fragmentation of Afghanistan, that it's an ethnic civil war, that it's going to break apart. And actually, there's a very well-developed and very strong sense of Afghan national identity, highly contested amongst different groups in Afghanistan, but nonetheless widely held. There is a chasm between that sense of national identity and its relationship with state architecture and state functions. But what we're not dealing with in Afghanistan is the lack of a national identity. Rather, it really goes to the pathologies of the Afghan state, the way that the Afghan state was created, maintained, and policed, both by elites within Afghanistan over the course of the 20th century, but also international patrons, which began with the British Empire and then was subsequently taken up by the United States, the Soviet Union, and then again the United States. And then the final comment that I'd briefly like to point out is a discussion that is not being had, and that is the almost incalculable cost of this war. Our best guess, which we know is an understatement, is that 140,000 Afghans have died. 5.3 million Afghans have been displaced, either as internally displaced people or overseas refugees. Those numbers are gross underestimates, and we know it. In addition to that, we have bodies that are maimed. We have an environment which has largely been destroyed, and we're seeing the consequences of that, for instance, in the current drought in Afghanistan, which then feeds into all types of other problems that the Afghan state has had in the past and that inflicts the Afghan people. There's also an enormous cost to the United States. A generational war has generational costs. When George Marshall was the Secretary of State following his stint as head of the army during the Second World War, he famously said, "A democracy cannot fight a 7 years war." And his concern was the cost it would have to democratic institutions. That is a conversation we have yet to even begin in this country. What is the cost of a 20 years war? $2.2 trillion, 2,500 service personnel dead, 20,000 injured. The cost is much higher than that. The cost to our democratic institutions, the cost to the way we behave towards one another, to the security architecture within our society itself, have been fundamentally rewritten through this experience. And we haven't even acknowledged it, much less come to terms with that. And then finally, we need to think about cost internationally. We can see that the international system is reverberating with the effects of the American withdrawal. There's a great deal of discussion about how this is the second war the United States has lost. There's very little discussion that this is the first war NATO has lost. It's the first war that NATO was actually declared a combatant in under Article 5 of its foundational treaty. We can see, for instance, in the past couple of weeks, the Chinese taking a more aggressive stance towards Taiwan, who in the immediate aftermath of the American withdrawal, they were already slagging off on Chinese Twitter to say, look, Taiwan, if the United States will not stand by its allies in Afghanistan, you have no chance. So, the reverberations across an American sponsored and secured international system are going to be longstanding and are going to take time to work themselves out. So I will stop there and look forward to the conversation and turn it back over to Lindsay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Dr. Sandal.
Thank you, Lindsay. And I would like to echo Professor Hopkins and thank the organizers and especially Corinne for all her help. As a political scientist, I will take the discussion into slightly different directions, although my remarks also coincide with Professor Farr and Professor Hopkins. And of course, given we each have 10 minutes, those are more like discussion items and questions than conclusions and thorough explanations. So I would like to draw our attention to 4 main points that I have been following very closely, and in addition to what has been said so far. One dimension that I find fascinating is Taliban's quest for external legitimacy. We have seen this most recently with the meeting in Moscow with Russia, China, Pakistan, India, Iran, and Central Asian states coming together, and with Taliban in calling for the United Nations to convene a donor conference. So these countries are interested in a stable Afghanistan and do not necessarily share some of the concerns we have discussed, like minority rights or women's inclusion. So it is not only the legitimacy in the eyes of the Western world, but obviously there's a greater world that has diverse interests when it comes to Afghanistan. And in 1990s, Taliban was recognized by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates, if I remember correctly, which is not surprising given Taliban's background in Pakistan and relation to Saudi funds. So we will see what is to come. And one of the main reasons why we have seen the moderate Taliban discourse is obviously this quest for legitimacy. It's one thing to conduct attacks, be in opposition, it's another thing to govern, like Professor Hopkins mentioned. There are big challenges awaiting any government in Afghanistan, and Taliban, in the absence of significant cash, or any cash, actually 90% of the population is at the poverty level, it's a challenge. And unless you have some significant international recognition, this is not going to happen. So they are trying to have a moderate discourse, trying to cater to different audiences. And US has, as we know, US has made it clear that national interest would define what the US position would be in long term. I mean, as Professor Farr mentioned, there are significant concerns about, of course, like women's rights and Shia rights. But US has traditionally stuck to a very realpolitik policy. So those concerns will not be necessarily parameters in US decisions. Moving from external legitimacy to a more internal one, Taliban is trying to gain a performance-based legitimacy, and they are trying to use the discourse of stamping out corruption and lawlessness that was the case in certain regions under Afghan security forces. So their discourses, they are trying to balance this slight human rights, women's rights, inclusion, moderation with a very hardcore law and order, Islamic law and order discourse. So they're also trying to navigate this politics. So when people discuss, oh, is Taliban sincere in its like promises or commitments, I will come to this point later, but I don't think Taliban is unified enough and determined enough to have any position right now. So they are saying it will depend from one day to another to what they do, what they say, in this desire to balance external and internal legitimacy. We talked a lot, I mean, we meaning like US public, talked a lot about Islamic State Khorasan threats. So this is an Islamic State branch that was established sometime between 2013 and 15. And we have seen their actions most recently with the Kabul, not most recently, but it came to US public opinion's attention with the Kabul bombings. And most recently, as Professor Farr mentioned, they had bombings in Shia regions. So this is an interesting group, and my research actually focuses mostly on Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban competitions and Haqqani networks. So that's really of interest to me, and I can talk for probably hours about this. But this group has attracted disaffected Pakistani Taliban members, and most recently also Afghan Taliban commanders who were once denounced by Mullah Akhtar Mohammed Mansour, the leader of Taliban, for being too extremist. So this group, Islamic State, Khorasan, is famous for their extremism, especially against the Shia population. And if you look at their attacks, they have targeted traditionally Shia areas, hospitals, maternity wards, schools, and most recently, places of worship. So Taliban leadership traditionally tried to avoid the Sunni-Shia split. And for many reasons, one of them is they didn't want Iran and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in their midst. And there is the Fatimiyun forces, which can be activated really quickly and be in the middle of this political situation. So this was something Taliban tried to stay away from, not because they love the Shia community, but because of strategic reasons. So this Islamic State Khorasan has the potential to draw this Shia issue back into the dynamics. Also, of course, these attacks aim to undermine this performative legitimacy of Taliban, that they aim to show that Taliban is not in control of Afghanistan and things happen under their close watch. So there will be, right now, the activities and those bombings, violence is confined to Afghanistan. But my concern is that as things move ahead, Islamic State Khorasan will gain more members with disaffected Taliban members and might want to have a show of force with select regional attacks that is beyond Afghanistan and even internationally. So we can talk about this in the Q&A period. They are very active in the, Islamic State has a very active digital presence. And there are many things going on in that sphere in Central Asia, in Muslim majority countries. So Al-Qaeda is trying to counter that Islamic State presence. Taliban is also noticing that it's not enough to control the physical sphere, but you need to also be active in that digital world, which is really fascinating. And recently, Taliban leaders actually said that they will allow TV, phones, and limited electronic gadgets because they don't have an option. It will probably be heavily controlled, but we are expecting this type of technological upgrades. And finally, one thing we should all pay attention to is the internal divisions within Taliban. The way US policy circles talk about Taliban is as if it was like this united organization. There are so many divisions, as we all know, those of us who are working on the region. First of all, like the lower level Taliban people on the ground. I mean, they brought this up, the Taliban officials, when they said that they cannot implement women's rights because these folks on the ground would need diversity training, like they are not used to women's rights and stuff. So that was a really interesting statement. Beyond that, when we look at the like Afghan government, so who do we have? We have folks like Mohammed Yaqub Mujahid, defense minister, right? And who is him? Who is he? He is the oldest son of Mohammed Omar, the guy who established Taliban, right? And then we have the Haqqani network in the government, Interior Minister Sirajuddin Haqqani. And I mean, Haqqani network is, as you know, the US designated terrorist organization. And he's on FBI's most wanted list. His uncle, Khalil Haqqani, has a $5 million bounty on him. And he's also on the special lists. So we have different hardcore figures who have not traditionally seen necessarily eye to eye in the government. Then you have folks who have been more diplomatic minded and wanted to see these negotiations and see a more, see a moderate Taliban, like the Deputy Foreign Minister, Mohammed Abbas Stanekzai, who is the head of Taliban's political office in Doha. So there is some diplomacy going on there. So they cannot agree necessarily on one course. And there are continuously these debates. And one of the debates actually was whether to include women or Shia in the government. Some segments of Taliban were ready for that, but it was quickly shut down by Mohammed Yaqub Mujahid and the Haqqani folks. So it is to be seen. I mean, do we know which segment will win over in long term? What is going to happen? It is to be seen, but we do need to pay attention to these political divisions, competition within the organizations without representing them necessarily as a monolith. I will stop here and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our presenters. Please, if you have a question, I invite you to type it in the chat box. I'll just start off with our first question from Hakan. Corruption is evident among Afghan soldiers. Even the prime minister fled the country with money, and the military collapsed in 2 days. Can you comment on the situation with regard to corruption, and if you see a particular U.S. administration as being responsible or particularly responsible or having shaped the situation with regard to corruption?
Grant, would you like to start?
Yeah, I guess this is a really good question for Ben, I think, quite frankly. I think the corruption has been profound. And not only has he pointed out, it's been a rentier state for centuries. And the estimate is that about a third of the billions of dollars that we put into Afghanistan has gone into corruption. But the problem isn't so much the Ghani government, although the rumors were that Ashraf left with a big suitcase full of $100 bills, but it's at the lower levels. Everything you want to do in Afghanistan, you have to bribe somebody to do it. You go to the hospital, you have to give a bribe to get into the hospital. If you go to get your passport, you have to give a bribe to get your, so on every level. And where it really particularly hurt was the corruption in the military, with regards to the ghost soldiers, I think, which people have read about, which were essentially on the books, there were soldiers, but they actually didn't exist, so that the generals could take the money for their salaries to themselves. So it eroded the faith in the Afghan government and the society, I think, that corruption. Now, corruption has always been, to some degree, at kind of a minor level, part of Afghan society. You understand that if you want to do a certain thing, you have to grease the skids, as we used to say. But I think that it's certainly one of the reasons, or one of the stated reasons, that the military collapsed. And the military started collapsing way before we thought they were, by the way. And when really the United States announced its pullout, even 2 years ago, people started leaving the military. They knew what was going to happen. But the corruption has been a major problem, particularly at the lower level. Now we're hearing, by the way, reports from villages, which they say, God, we're glad the Taliban came in. They're honest with regards to stuff. Yeah, they take a tax, but that's it, and whereas with the government kept bleeding them and bleeding them and bleeding them. So this remains to be kind of examined, but I think the corruption is a major problem, and it's a major reason that a lot of people were so upset with the government. Now, Ghani himself, I don't think, was corrupt, but everyone around him was, and he facilitated. I have a question, if I could jump in with a question, Lindsay. This is to Ben. And while you were talking, I was there's been a lot of discussion, at least among some of my friends, about the Bonn Conference in 2001, and that really created the government, Karzai, and then it not only created the government, but it created they eventually wrote a constitution that has a parliament that basically is a model of the United States and elections and so on. It didn't work. It basically, that the whole thing with the Bonn Conference, if people are looking at that conference again, if people aren't familiar with it, what the Bonn Conference was is what in that fall or winter after we came in and helped the Northern Alliance in driving out the Taliban, a bunch of people were gathered with the United States backing largely in Bonn to come up with a government. And they decided that Karzai would be an interim leader and then later wrote a constitution. A lot of people saying that conference really was a mistake. Ben, do you have thoughts about that?
So if I can respond briefly to the corruption question and then respond to Grant's. There's three things I would say about the question with corruption. First of all, in Afghanistan, it's structural. Charles Tilley, who's a historical sociologist, I think really hit the nail on the head when he says states are organized protection rackets. And what we have with the Afghan state is a fairly ineffective organized protection racket that isn't able to assert its authority convincingly, which means there's a lot of bleeding out on the side. But the weakness of the state is intentional as well with how it was historically constructed. None of those who were involved in constructing an Afghan state wanted a strong state structure, right? And also today, our liberal sensibilities about what a state does makes it state construction a difficult undertaking because as a historian, the first and foremost thing about constructing a state is that it's very violent, right? So, it's not a big love in constructing a state. Usually it's about one force exerting a monopoly of violence through violence. The second thing I'd say about corruption is that there's an incredible gaze on the Afghan corruption, which was pronounced, and I think Grant really hits it on the head, and very little discussion about the American corruption. I mean, for example, through a no-bid contract, BAE Systems was given $730 million to run a disastrous program called the Human Terrain System that did absolutely nothing. Now the US defense budget, 53% of that goes to pay private contractors. And there's hardly any discussion of that. That's over $300 billion a year. Compare that to the $60 billion a year we were annually putting into Afghanistan. So, if we're going to have a discussion about corruption, which I think is long overdue, let's have a discussion about corruption. The last part of that question was about why is Biden getting so much gruff? And, in the days of our fractious politics, as it were, Afghanistan is a real point of unity because this is an enormous American screw up. Every single administration is responsible here, from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. But more than that, and perhaps incredibly so, this is a cross-branch screw up. This is not just the president. This is about the legislative branch that shortly after the American intervention in 2001 wiped their hands of this war and conveniently forgot it until they could, bring the Biden administration up to the hill and roast their petard. But no congressman has put his or her electoral fortunes on the line for Afghanistan over the past 20 years. So let's not kid ourselves that, the legislative branch has done anything great here, nor for that matter has the judicial branch, which until a ruling today has continued to allow not only the torture of individuals by American government officials disguised under the guise of state secrets, but also has allowed for patently illegal, extra-legal territory in Guantanamo Bay, which continues to this day, although apparently we have the first detainee who's been given a writ of habeas corpus. So, this really runs across the gambit. And to say nothing as well of the fact that we live in a democratic polity and we are responsible for this as well. There has never been a sustained anti-war coalition about the Afghanistan conflict as there was in Iraq. At no point in time over the past 20 years has the American popular opinion spoiled on the war in Afghanistan. Even with the pullout in August, it wasn't the pullout itself which people were upset about, but the manner in which it was done. So I think, we need to really bear that in mind. Briefly, to answer Grant's question about the Bonn conference and that this will be, part of the postmortem for time to come. Clearly, what Bonn was trying to do was create a structure of politics that some are going to argue Afghanistan was not ready for, the state was not ready for. On the one hand, it was an attempted federalized constitution like the United States. But on the other hand, it then created this highly centralized monster that allowed Karzai and then Ghani, and also necessitated them from the center to largely dispense patronage to different networks. I think it goes back to the broader point. It's not really either my place or Americans' place to say this was correct or incorrect. I think it goes back to that point that I made about the collapse of the Afghan political compact. Bonn was an attempt to reconstruct some version of a workable political compact. I don't think it succeeded for various reasons, but I think that leads us to where we are today with an open question of, okay, if Bonn didn't work and we can't go back to pre-Saur revolution, which we definitely can't, what is a workable Afghan political compact going to look like moving forward?
And I would like to address the corruption question a little bit. So Hakan is one of my wonderful students, so I would be remiss if I don't address the question. So we should also look at how US operates in these interventions in general. Some of the same issues happened in Iraq, right? And it caused the gap that gave the scene to ISIS and some other groups. So giving the money is one thing, and investigating how it is used or putting in the necessary mechanisms to make sure that it will be spent in those ways is another thing. And of course, that's costly by itself as well. US has traditionally not been interested in that part and just send the money thinking that this would solve the problem. And in Iraq, like this happened in a way when US was withdrawing and gave all the power to Maliki, and then that created the kind of imbalance. So this is when we talk to folks on the ground and those who are serving there, this was one of the biggest concerns. Like the money is coming, you see the money is coming, and folks on the ground are seeing where the money is going. And one of those PR movements, as we all know, is when Taliban goes into these houses, and these videos are shown really widely in the Muslim world, like in Central Asia, in Middle East, multiple houses that have like bathrooms out of gold and this like really opulent palace-like houses. And you see these guys, Taliban officers who came from the mountains who are like, what is this? So that is one of their PR moves to show that, look, here, this is what America is. And that's what they say. And here we are trying to find some rice and some meat to have our dinner. So I mean, for folks who are living there, if you are a villager, if you are a farmer who have suffered from Afghan security forces, yes, there are segments that probably say, not probably, I mean, we know there are segments that say that, yes, I mean, stability is in and this corruption has decreased. So maybe we should just be satisfied with this. So there are definitely multiple dimensions of this question, but it is right now heavily used as part of the Taliban PR plans.
We also have a question about efforts to help Afghanis who have worked with the United States in the past or are vulnerable for other reasons as well. Deborah asks, how realistic is it for us to try to help a former student who went back to Kabul after finishing her degree in a Fulbright fellowship to get out of the country? I'm told she is from a tribe that is at higher risk under the Taliban government. Any tips to help her beyond what we've already centers?
Well, we've been trying to get, like I said, I've been trying to get some of the Hazars out, and it's very difficult. There was also recently the students at the American University of Kabul, which apparently some of those people got out as well. It's really difficult to know what to do, quite frankly. It's those people who had worked directly and have evidence that they worked directly for the American government have been able to, some of them have been able to get out. But I really don't have much to add here because it's really a really difficult situation. We were trying to get Australia has been taking some of the Hazaras, and although Australia is in a fairly particularly conservative government right now, kind of anti-immigrant, but we've been looking for places for them to go, I just take cases one at a time, kind of, and trying to find the right way. You have to establish, there's forms. I don't know if you're aware of this. There's particular forms that you try to establish some kind of connection to the Americans in such a way that you can show that they're in some danger. But then the question is, how do they get out? Some of the Hazaras have gotten out by going overland into Pakistan and gotten out that way. But it's a tricky situation. There are lawyers, and I would talk to the people, and I think we have talked to the people at Lutheran Family Services here, who's actually been involved in trying to get people out. And that's really all I have to say on that.
Some of my students have also asked in speaking at the regime, and there will be some kind of competition for control of the state. Is there anything that any of you would add to how you would describe the regime, especially from a political side?
I'm not sure I understood the question. It was cutting a little bit from my side. Could you please repeat, Lindsay?
Sure. I'm just wondering, especially from a political science point of view, how we can understand the government in Afghanistan or the regime. Can we just simply describe it as a transitional regime where different factions will try to negotiate for power and take control of the government, or is there some other way that we should describe the regime?
Well, from political science, from any perspective, actually, it currently lacks the level of internal and external recognition and legitimacy to be called anything. So I don't know whether transitional would be the right word necessarily. In political science, we call it a mess, but it is really difficult to see where things will go. And right now, they are scrambling around to consolidate some of the power too, with these meetings with the outside possible donors, with other countries. My personal perspective is most of this will depend on Russian and Chinese recognition. And if those come before some others, there might be some chance for cash transfer, some more money, and maybe they would invest towards internal legitimacy, and we will see what happens. But there is also the likelihood with all these competing factions, things might go down into a form of civil war. And then they might not be, it is too generous to say that they are controlling right now anyways, but that control might further decrease. So I think it would be really disingenuous if any of us says that, this is going to go this way. We are all watching it very closely day to day, and we will see how it goes. But yes, they are right now trying to create that definition, what they are, by looking for these dimensions of legitimacy and also trying to come to an agreement among themselves, which will be very difficult for the reasons I mentioned.
If I could just add on to that really quickly, Lindsay, from a historical perspective, I think this is akin to the situation in 1998 after the Taliban took over Mazar-e Sharif in August of that year. Just to refresh really quick, the Taliban at that point in time, as this Taliban, was largely, the creature of, if not supported by, various elements of the Pakistani state. And when they took Mazar-e-Sharif in August of that year, retook it, part of what happened was a promise by the Pakistanis that once you do this, you'll control 80 to 90% of the country, you'll control all the major urban spaces. The international community might find you distasteful, but they will have to recognize you. And what happened was actually quite the opposite. Only Pakistan, UAE, and Saudi recognized the Taliban. And actually this fed into the factionalism of the Taliban. At that point in time, moderates lost out. It allowed for bin Laden to come and say, see, I told you these guys would never play ball with you. And it kind of led to a radicalization of the Taliban, which then led to the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas and such later in the Taliban's life. And I think we're, I said earlier, the past is not a great guide to the future, but I think we're in a not dissimilar position. And the Taliban knows it. That's why they are so desperate to get international recognition. And the only thing I would add substantively to Nukhet's point about China and Russia is also they're desperate to get the United Nations back in. Because, as Grant has rightly pointed out, these guys, they don't know how to govern. That they absolutely do not have the ability to govern at all. And in fact, part of the reason that you might not see a large-scale outbreak of sectarian violence is that much of the government is manned by Shias, not Hazaras, but Kizilbash, a number of Tajiks, and some Badakhshanis. And those are the actual people that can execute government policies. So, the Taliban itself remembers this 98 moment. They remember how that quickly went downhill and they were quickly isolated. And I'm sure that has partly accounts for their actions today and their desperation to get both the spigots open with direct funding so they can spread that around the system, but also somebody they can hand the responsibilities of government off to, because not only are they incapable of governing, I don't think they frankly want to.
Thank you. We also have a question about the role of Qatar as an intermediary in the negotiations. Would anyone like to say more about that role and how we might interpret it, or what some of the implications may be for Afghanistan or perhaps even beyond?
Well, it is, some of these things are shaped by what we call in political science role conceptions, and how different actors in the Middle East and in the world want to create an image of themselves. So the reason for obviously Qatar's involvement, and I would add to that also Turkey, a desire to play a role in Afghanistan, is to look like that you are the mediator, you are the negotiator and solver of a problem that seemed really challenging to outside actors. And what would that mean? So everything happens in Qatar. So the money would come, the capital would come, it would have business implications. And also we know that Qatar has had a very fragile status in the Middle East in general. And Qatar and Turkey has special links, and I'm not going to go into that debate right now, but both of them being really close to each other are trying to create this image of being the Turkey regional leader in a way, and Qatar also like being the negotiator, mediator, maybe middle power that creates some space for these constructive discussions. And they would, of course, stay away from anything too controversial, but their goal right now is to play a role no other regional actor would dare to play. So I would attribute that mostly to the role conceptions of Qatar and Turkey. And if any of my colleagues would like to establish the specific link with Afghanistan, I would love to hear that.
Right, thank you. I might ask a question about ways you think that ordinary citizens can help people from either who are refugees or recent immigrants from Afghanistan or organizations in Afghanistan?
Well, it's really tough right now. Just to, like I say, I've been trying to be involved, and it's very difficult. I mean, to figure out what you can do to help. Like I say, we expect to get some Afghans up into the Portland area, and as you know, we've been looking to find places to house them and help them, and I've offered to help translate and things like that. So, but I think for as an individual, it's really hard to get hard to figure out what you can do to really help Afghans and Afghanistan as a country right now. Um, I, the whole thing is really puzzling. I mean, with Khalilzad, the whole Khalilzad story, that's another whole story we could talk about. Those of us who know him, and with regards to that. But I think once again, it's we're going to have to watch to see what happens and how Afghanistan plays out.
I would actually echo what Grant had said earlier. I think Grant, you brought up Lutheran services, who I know out in DC are doing quite a bit. There's a large diaspora community out here, so there are ways to get plugged in depending on where you are. You know, there's a large diaspora community down in the Bay Area as well. More broadly, I would actually encourage all of us, hold people responsible.
Right.
This has been a disaster in the making, and it's one that is going to negatively affect our own society as well as Afghan society for years to come. And we should not allow those in power to walk away from this absolute pile of crap that they have left on all of us. So I think we can help Afghans best by holding people responsible.
And I would like to add to that, it is, of course, that's the critical central question, but this holding responsible part is very important for the US actors who were involved there too. The rate of suicide has significantly increased among service members who served in Afghanistan after the withdrawal. So there are really some concerning numbers. There were people with ideals and a certain vision, and all of a sudden, what did this all mean? So we should ask that question of what did this all mean if where we end up is here. So it is really a critical starting point that we should not neglect. And unfortunately, like it was said in the beginning, we were talking about this a month ago all the time, and right now you can barely see the titles like in the newspapers and networks. So that is really concerning, both in terms of like our responsibility to people in Afghanistan, but also our own responsibility to our own service members.
You know, I'm struck by, in my generation, I'm older than most people, of the Vietnam situation, and in Vietnam, over a period of time, we brought over 600,000 Vietnamese to the United States. Right now, we have 120 Afghans or something like that have come out. People continue to come out, but we don't seem to have the same attitude or same notion that somehow we owe the Afghans something, and that we should facilitate their coming to the United States. And of course, you all know that the Vietnamese immigrants that came to the United States turned out to be wonderful citizens and work at our university and all types of things. So I agree. We can't let this go. This is a terrible thing, and we really have to hold our elected officials. I must say, not to bring out particular people, when I called the offices of our representatives and senators, you know, I got a nice, polite answer from the answering person that answers the phone, and but not very much else from them.
Thank you. Is there one final question that anyone would like to ask? All right, well, thank you. Thank you to our panelists. We really appreciated hearing your perspectives. And we're all of you for being here today. I hope you have a wonderful week and look forward to seeing you at future events. So thank you again.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Stay safe, everyone.